All right, we are going to go ahead and get started if Leslie is ready. So I'm just going to go ahead and give you an introduction of Leslie. Leslie Williams has worked in public and academic libraries for more than 15 years. She currently manages the acquisition of library materials for the University of Colorado, Denver. As a public librarian in Florida, Williams gained extensive experience in county-level emergency management operations during the 2004 and 2005 hurricane seasons. For Hurricane Katrina, Williams deployed as a volunteer first responder with the Disaster Animal Response Team. And in 2010, Williams combined her interests in cultural heritage and emergency management when she co-founded the Colorado Cultural and Historic Resources Task Force in conjunction with the Colorado Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. The CHR Task Force works to improve the state of Colorado's mitigation, response, and recovery efforts for cultural and historic resources. Williams coordinated the CHR Task Force's participation in the Colorado State Emergency Operations Center during the 2012 and 2013 wildfires and floods to provide assistance to cultural heritage institutions affected by the disasters. And the CDRE is very excited to host her for the first virtual seminar series today. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Leslie.
Well, it's still morning here in Mountain Standard Time, so I'll say good morning to everyone. So as was just explained to you, I did get my start in Florida. The way I got my start in Florida was I was actually working for a county-wide public library system at the time. And I was working behind the scenes, so I was not in a public facility. So when 2004 rolled around and we were threatened with multiple tropical storms and hurricanes, I was told to go run the telephone bank in the county EOC. And that was prior to social media communication and really expensive online communication. So I ended up spending over 200 hours running a staff of 10, 24/7 during a number of events. After that, I got additional training from our county emergency managers in ICS and NIMS, which then led to me in 2005 being deployed to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, 3 weeks after Hurricane Katrina. And I was actually working at a temporary animal shelter at the time. We went from about 300 animals to over 1,000 animals, mostly dogs and cats, within 1 week. And so that was quite an experience. I've also worked a criminal case in Tennessee, shutting down a puppy mill, which is a different type of disaster. And then I got married and had kids, and deploying was really no longer an option for me. So I actually got married and moved to Colorado. And at that point in time, I had the opportunity to start working with our state EOC folks on cultural and historic resources. That was in January of 2011. That was January of 2012. In March of 2012, the first of over 20 wildland fires and historic flooding hit Colorado within the span of 2 years. So I have a wide range of experience with different types of disasters, natural disasters, working in an operational capacity, working with companion animals, and as well as working with cultural and historic resources. But today I really want to talk to you about cultural and historic resources because after Hurricane Katrina, cultural and historic resources really came to the forefront of emergency management thinking when FEMA identified recovery of cultural and historic resources as one of the core capabilities our nation should have. Subsequently, the cultural and historic resources community has been working on trying to develop our capacity throughout the nation. However, I will say, due to necessity, due to fires and flooding, Colorado really is leading the nation in that effort. And so I want to talk to you today about what specifically we're doing in Colorado, but also just give you a little bit of information that about cultural and historic resources. What should the emergency management and CHR communities be thinking about, and how should they be collaborating? And then I'll try to share some lessons learned as well. And then I'll specifically talk about higher education's role, simply because that is really my niche, if you will. And I am a strong believer that higher education actually should be playing a significant role when it comes to our nation's capacity in dealing and protecting cultural and historic resources. So to kind of get started, the first thing I like to do is what I call forming a common operating picture. This probably isn't news to you guys, but when emergency managers and a specific community initially get together, they often are speaking Greek to each other. And so I always like to start off with kind of talking about what are really some key elements of cultural and historic resources, and then also what are some key elements of emergency management, and what should those two communities really be focusing on with each other. So let's get started with that. The first thing is what are cultural and historic resources? Now, I really don't expect you to read this definition. This is a good definition. It's actually taken from several national documents from the National Park Service and from a FEMA publication. FEMA actually has a really great publication called Integrating Historic Property and Cultural Resource Considerations into Hazard Mitigation Planning. And you can Google it and find it. But this is the formal definition we adopted in Colorado. But really, here are some key elements of it that you may or may not have thought about. So the first thing that cultural and historic resources is really that they're unique. So think about, I don't know, the latest John Grisham novel, right? There are going to be literally hundreds of thousands of copies around the world. But as time goes on, when that book goes out of print, and as time goes on, those copies are going to be destroyed, thrown away, what have you. And at some point, you're going to be down to a very limited supply of those. And so they become more valuable and unique, and they are irreplaceable. And so that's why, one reason why CHR is so important during disasters for us to be thinking about our cultural and historic resources, is because it's not something you can necessarily go out and buy a replacement of. So cultural CHR also requires inventory control, security measures, environmental monitoring. We'll talk about some of these things more, but I really want to touch on the environmental monitoring. Again, people don't often stop and think about, hey, again, we have cultural and historic resources over the span of time of human history. And those materials, if exposed to prolonged sunlight, prolonged whatever, can damage those materials. And so environmental monitoring, having typically temperature and humidity controls in place is crucial. Emergency managers would like to tell people you better have insurance. Yes, you better have insurance, absolutely. But one challenge for us is actually assigning a value to CHR for insurance purposes. And so oftentimes when CHR are damaged, trying to get insurance to pony up is extremely difficult. Hazardous materials is another thing I really want to touch on. Again, we are talking about artifacts and other things that span the course of human history. So during the course of human history, different materials have been used to create different things. So when you're dealing with CHR, you must remember that you may potentially encounter things like asbestos, okay, or other things that now, in today's time, we would consider hazardous, but when that item was made, was not considered hazardous. So you don't necessarily want to run into a building that houses hazardous, that houses THR without some thought about PPE or perhaps testing the air or those types of activities. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. Some additional things is that, CHR is found everywhere. You may not even realize some of the places where cultural and historic resources can be found. One example that I came across that surprised me during the Colorado floods is I got a phone call from the Boulder, Colorado Canyon hydro plant. And I'm thinking, what is a hydro plant doing calling me? But this hydro plant was actually created in the 1800s. Their building and architecture actually qualifies for the National Register of Historic Places. But even more important than that, they had historic water rights maps and architectural drawings and things that when you start to think about water rights, you don't necessarily think that some of that historic information could be so significant, but it can be. And so that was one that surprised me. So you might want to just keep in mind, I actually, just a month ago, switched jobs, and I'm no longer with CU Denver, but I'm actually with the Colorado Department of Public Safety now. And part of the Department of Public Safety is the Colorado State Patrol. I walked into one of their buildings recently, and there was an old historic police car sitting in their lobby. And I'm like, okay, that's a cultural and historic resource that I never would have expected to find here, but that I need to let our task force know about. And so it's not only the obvious places, it is going to be embedded throughout our communities and even in our own homes. So just to give you a couple of examples of what I am aware of that's in higher education, the first drawing on the top left is actually the Health Sciences Library of CU Denver, and it is a historic centrifuge. Below that building is actually on CU Boulder's campus, and it is their library, which is actually a designated historical site. The butterfly is actually part of a 3 million specimen collection at Colorado State University of arthropods. And then below that, at the University of Northern Colorado, is James Michener's archival collection of all of his papers and his manuscript drafts. And so that gives you a little bit of an idea of what kind of variety we're talking about. And one reason why I am a strong believer that emergency managers in higher education need to engage with each other when it comes to cultural and historic resources. I do not have any data to support this assumption, but I would be willing to bet money that our higher education systems are some of our largest holders of cultural and historic resources throughout our nation. So that's what, when I'm talking to emergency managers, those are some of the key elements that I try to highlight about cultural and historic resources. When I'm talking to the cultural and historic resources community, I try to give them some key things about the emergency management community that they most likely don't know. And one of the key things is that first responders and emergency managers are different people. They think that emergency managers, and this is probably no surprise to you guys, but they think that emergency managers are always the first responders. It's police, fire, rescue, that sort of thing. And I really try to inform them that yes, first responders are a critical element of our emergency management system, but there is a lot of coordination that goes on behind the scenes to support those first responders with intelligence, with resources, and with funding. And that, believe it or not, is often eye-opening to them. The other thing I try to express to them is that the role of emergency managers is really collaboration and coordination and providing access to emergency operations centers. If emergency managers aren't going to do it for the cultural and historic resources community, and again, that's often very eye-opening for them, that they really need to take responsibility for their own community. So I encourage emergency managers to express that role to the CHR community and vice versa. That it's about collaboration. That emergency management can offer, the CHR community a seat at the table. That they can help with things like including CHR into planning documents. They can provide access to operation and recovery conference calls during disasters and situational awareness. So those sorts of things. So just be very explicit about what emergency managers offer. And then I tell CHR, the subject matter experts, first of all, I make sure that they understand that they are the subject matter experts, and that it's really their responsibility to collaborate with emergency management, that it is the CHR community's responsibility to integrate into the emergency management structure, and to really to fill that SME role and to provide technical assistance and situational awareness about their own community to the state EOC. And I often have conversations with them that it's extremely important that the CHR respect that life safety is the top priority in any sort of disaster situation. And while cultural and historic resources are extremely important, ultimately they are not the top priority. And cultural and historic resource folks are extremely passionate about their community, and sometimes to such a degree that it could be construed as assault, but at the same time that passion is also what motivates them to take responsibility for their community and to act. So let's talk about what we're doing in Colorado specifically. So in January of 2012, I happened to meet with some state emergency managers. I actually, a couple months prior to that, I was part of our state animal disaster response team, and I was sitting in a state EOC exercise, and I turned to the person next to me from the Department of Agriculture, and I said, hey, you guys are responsible for cultural and historic resources. What are you doing? What's happening with that? And it was the assistant state veterinarian who turned and looked at me and said, nothing. So this is something you guys will often experience, is that cultural and historic resources fall kind of under the natural resources umbrella, which often falls under like the Department of Ag. And that's not really the greatest fit for an emergency operations center. And so I encourage you to think about dividing the cultural and historic resources out into its own emergency support function, which is exactly what we've done here in Colorado. And so we have now at the state EOC ESF 11D specifically for cultural and historic resources. And that ESF is actually coordinated by our task force. I'm actually the point person. I'm on our state EOC email distribution list. I monitor activation levels and disasters, and when it's necessary for our task force to go into action, I pull that trigger. So the task force is just that. It's exactly what, as FEMA has defined it. It's a group of similar but different resources really operating together in a unified situation with a common leader. And our common leader really is our task force. We have a steering committee that leads our task force. We were formed in January 2012. We were intentionally built a partnership between collections, historic preservation, which is more of a built environment, and emergency management. And that characteristic of our task force right there is extremely uncommon. So collections are things like libraries, museums. Historic preservation is your built environment, and so it's going to be your historic structures. And getting those two communities to play well with each other and with emergency management is not always an easy task. So we started out just a group of folks who were interested in this and getting together, sitting around a table, and before we knew it, we had 140 individuals around the state and even beyond connected and responding to fires and floods. We had initially started out, the goal was just to assist our state emergency management office with developing a recovery annex. That didn't happen right away. Instead, we started responding to fires and floods. But we did get back to the recovery annex eventually. So, in action, what do we actually do? We actually do coordinate ESF 11D. We participate in operations and recovery coordination calls. Our task force, whoever is the ESF 11D for that operational period, is responsible for trying to identify cultural and historic resources at risk and communicating that to the state EOC to create situational awareness and advocating, if necessary, for the ICP, whether it's one or Colorado, we had multiple ICPs running at the same time, so depending on the geographical location, communicating information to the ICP so that they could take protective measures for cultural and historic resources. We also mobilize and coordinated assistance. I mean, again, no one's going to do this for the CHR community. We do not have any MOUs in place, and we basically had no sort of assistance network in place. We did all of this just through word of mouth and people we knew. So that's a little bit about the task force. We continue to meet on a regular basis. As you can imagine, by 2014 we were exhausted, and so we took about 6 months off, as did most of the state of Colorado, and then we regrouped, and now we're meeting again because our vision really is not to solely focus on the response phase, but also to be helping the CHR and emergency management communities address the other phases, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery as well. So just trying to be a little bit mindful of our time, I want to talk about some lessons learned. So identifying cultural and historic resources is challenging. Everyone always kind of starts out from the mindset, well, why can't we just create a database? So it's just not that easy. There are so many cultural and historic resources throughout all of our states. And in Colorado alone, I mean, less than 15% of our historic buildings and sites have actually been inventoried. So our state history office, History Colorado, that's their goal, is to eventually inventory our entire state. And you can do that with historic buildings and sites because they don't move. They're fixed structures and sites. It will, however, take them decades to get 100% of our state inventoried. For collections like libraries and museums and your local historical society, there is no central repository of information. So people always want to try to create that repository, but that literally could be a full-time position devoted to doing nothing but that, and that's just unrealistic. And so you have to be creative about how you can identify cultural and historic resources. And so we used Compass, which is History Colorado's database. We did have one database that was created a few years ago off of a grant, but we quickly found out that was already very much out of date. But really one of our biggest tools is that we created a listserv. And that listserv has those 140 people on that I mentioned earlier. And then we also use things like the National Register of Historic Places. We reach out to professional associations that we're members of and ask them to put out a call on their listserv. Does anyone know about anything that might be affected? We do workshops. We use internet sites for tourism. But another huge one for us, again, is actually local knowledge. And so the power of our listserv really became evident to me in the Royal Gorge Fire. And if you don't know about the Royal Gorge Fire, it was an extremely historic site that with quite a bit of devastation. But the Royal Gorge Fire, I got a phone call. No, actually, I got a listserv message about 10 o'clock one morning from a local person who works in the Cultural and Historic Resources community in Canyon City, Colorado. She said, Leslie, we have another fire. I can see it. I had not even been notified by our state emergency operations center yet. And literally like 20 minutes later, the call went out, we have another fire. And for those of you who have never experienced the type of fires we have here in Colorado, our entire state, I'm talking local, county, state, even national, the national EOC stands up in a matter of hours. I've seen our state stand up over and over in a matter of at the most 4 hours. It's not what most people think of when they think of a fire, a house fire or a building fire. Our fires are quick. I mean, fire is fast. And you have to be able to literally drop everything you're doing and move. So that's actually how I learned about the Royal Gorge Fire. And I was actually able to activate before the state EOC even had activated us. And we actually, another lesson that we learned is that we rely on local knowledge so much that those fires that were actually in the western part of our state and the southern part of our state, where the population is less sparse, or is sparser than what we have on the Front Range, we didn't have local knowledge to tap into, and that's when we were our weakest. Well, in addition to just being exhausted. So I really encourage you to think about in your state, not trying to create a central repository, but really creating what I call kind of a network of networks, okay? There are a lot of existing networks. Professional associations have all kinds of listservs. You have a state tourism office that has a database. You have a History Colorado that has a database. Avoid recreating that, but connect people. And cultivate local representatives throughout your state. And again, a listserv is an easy way to do that. We do not use our listserv on a regular basis intentionally. We don't want people to view our listserv as just trash. When they get a message from our listserv, we want them to pay attention. So we really only use it when there is a disaster or when we feel like we need to communicate significant information. So I would encourage you to think about that if you're thinking about connecting with your cultural and historic resource communities. Security. Cultural and historic resources. Security matters. I cannot stress this enough. And why does security matter? Okay, so security matters for a number of reasons. So the first one is that, again, there's a limited supply of the things we're talking about. They're valuable. Some of them are literally priceless. And so you have to take that into consideration. Wherever the permanent location is of that artifact needs to be a secure location. And if that location is damaged, there may need to be a security guard posted, or police, or something to help ensure the security of that location. If you evacuate a collection to a temporary location, again, is not something that you want to be, you want it to be a secure facility. And what I mean by that is you really want it to be something that, first of all, the general public doesn't know about. You do not want to disseminate this information widely. You want it to be a locked facility if at all possible, right? And you want them access to that facility to be limited to very few people. And so information about what's been affected and where it's located should also not be disseminated widely. So during the flood, I got a call from Colorado Public Radio. And they're like, oh, we want to know what's going on with cultural and historic resources. And I'm like, no thanks. I'm like, we appreciate your concern, but right now, we're not in a situation to be giving any stories, and primarily because we're concerned about looting. And so, think about that, but you have to. Looting is a very real possibility. And whether it is a collection, or whether it's an archaeological site, or whether it's a historic building, there are people who will take advantage of a situation and come in and take whatever they can. So, transmission of information. There are actually, particularly when we're talking about historic preservation in the built environment, there are some national laws that dictate how that information can be handled and transmitted. And so if you're working with historic preservation folks, don't be surprised if they don't want to use things like Dropbox or Google Drive or anything in the cloud, because those types of things don't necessarily meet the standards that they have to meet for security. And so also I caution you when you're developing situational awareness reports that have information about cultural and historic resources, that you take a moment to think, is this something that needs to have limited distribution, or is this okay to disseminate more widely? All right, significance. So when I say significant, I mean just how rare something is. I mean, is it literally irreplaceable? And so this is a great, so I have 3 examples here. The Western Museum of Mining and Industry, Black Forest Fire down in Colorado Springs, was affected. I was literally on the phone with them, checking in with them one afternoon. And as we were on the phone, we had the evacuation map projected up on a computer screen. And I went, holy cow, you just went from a pre-evacuation zone to a mandatory evacuation zone. And the gentleman I was talking to, as many of us do, could only think about his family. He's like, oh my God, I have to call my wife. I have to go home. And so I said, yes, you go do that. And then have your manager call me back. And their manager called me back. And we were a little uncertain. We were kind of hearing through the grapevine that the change in evacuation zones was a little bit hasty, but we have no choice but to follow the official warning. And they happen to have some extremely rare artifacts and collections. There were primarily local history about the Colorado Springs mining industry over from the 1800s. And so we dropped everything. We coordinated assistance. The Air Force Academy is down there. We were able to get trucks and cadets to come over to help evacuate. They rented U-Haul trucks, and they were literally, and I arranged for a police escort back into the mandatory evacuation zone to ensure that they were safe and were able to access their site and get in and out. We found, we did all of this in less than an hour. They spent 2 hours evacuating the most precious materials, and everything was saved. Fortunately, their buildings weren't threatened in the end either. That was one of our most amazing stories. Walsenburg Mining Museum is a completely different story. It's a local history museum, primarily consisting of newspapers, old newspapers that have been digitized, that are available through our university system. And it's a cultural and historical society that's primarily run by volunteers. And I have to say, I'm sorry, but, you know, there's not much I can do to help you. Fortunately, close by is another cultural and historic resources, the Francisco Fort Museum. Also, again, maybe not the most rare collection, but they readily reached out to Waltenberg Mining Museum and said, hey, if you get into a tight spot, call us and we will do what we can to help you. And that's really, when I talk about providing assistance to cultural and historic resources, we're not really drawing upon the emergency management community. We really are primarily drawing upon our own community. And I really believe that we have most of the tools that we need. We just have to get organized and be in communication with each other. So one more lesson about significance, and then I'll move on. So we kind of embarrassed ourselves. I forget which fire it was even. But we had a list of historic structures that we had gotten, and we did not take the time to evaluate the significance of those listed that had been inventoried. And we asked the disaster assessment team to go out and assess a stone fence, a historic stone fence. And so that experience really taught us that we need to be filtering some of our requesting and information that we're passing along. Redundancy, adaptability, and flexibility matter. This was the Waldo Canyon fire. So we had UPass Historical Society. They actually do have a nice collection, and they needed to evacuate, and we made arrangements. At that time, I was at FEED Denver. I reached out to CU Colorado Springs, my colleagues there, and I said, hey, can you guys help this historical society out? Can you give them some temporary space to evacuate your collection? And they're like, oh, sure. We got everything in place literally within an hour. Within 30 minutes after solidifying all of the arrangements, get a call from UPass Historical Society, we can't make it to Colorado Springs. The roads are closed. Evacuation routes are going west, not east. And so they actually ended up having to drive several hours west to another town and house their collection there. And so again, just being aware that your geography, particularly if you're in a mountainous state or you may have other terrain considerations, that your geography can play a significant role in your planning. So this is actually one of my pet peeves. So I have actually experienced 3 kinds of disasters: hurricanes, fires, and flooding. And I think that one thing that often is not clearly communicated between our emergency managers and our cultural and historic resources community is when to take action and when to sit tight. Okay, there's a rhythm to these events. So in Florida, for example, I learned through my experience there that the state of Florida most likely, so when I was in Florida, I was in a county just north of Tampa. And Tampa Bay, I mean, if a hurricane hits Tampa Bay, it's going to be as bad as Katrina. But I learned that they would most likely never call for any sort of mandatory evacuation of the west coast of Florida, because that decision would have to be made when the hurricane is still down near the southern tip and even a little east of Florida, in order to have sufficient time to properly evacuate the population there. And so so understanding that, I think, alters what kind of decisions or advice or recommendations you're making, right? The same thing with fires. When we have a red flag warning here, I can guarantee you there's a fire somewhere in our state. It may be small or it may be big. But the red flag warning days that come out, what's going to happen is you need to be taking action by noon, because most likely by 1 or 2 o'clock that fire is spiking and moving. And if you haven't made some decisions and taken action, you're screwed. Drowning. So when we had the floods here, I actually lived in Oklahoma for several years where there's quite a bit of flash flooding. So I knew that, when you have flooding, you stay put. I mean, really, literally don't take any action, and definitely don't drive through any sort of water. And so when our flooding occurred here, that was my advice to people. Guys, right? Most drownings and floods are vehicle related. You don't even want to drive through a foot of standing water. We're not going to do anything until after the fact. We need to sit tight. And so those sorts of characteristics of different types of natural disasters, I think, are extremely important to be communicated between communities. So incident action plans matter. So I have to say I'm pretty proud of this one too. As far as I know, this is one of the few, if not the only time, cultural and historic resources have actually been included in an IAP. And it was for the West Fork Fire Complex, specifically for South Fork, Colorado. Small town, 600 people. You wouldn't even begin to think that there would be a lot of cultural and historic resources in that area, but it actually is home to a historic railroad and was built, and that town was built in the 1800s. It has historic buildings, as well as a historic Pullman railroad car that it's home to. And so when we found this out, fortunately through some local knowledge of the area, we were able to map those historic sites and structures and communicate that map with latitudes and longitudes to the ICP and say, hey guys, can you just at least be aware of these? And next thing we know, they're actually putting an objective into the IAP to try to minimize the suppression impacts to those resources. And as far as I know, we didn't lose any. I think the fire came in about within a mile of the town. So so those are my lessons learned. I hope you find it interesting. I really want to just take a moment again to stress higher education's role. So as I say, I'm no longer actually within higher education, I'm now within state government. However, higher education in our task force has played a significant role. And I believe that if you're interested in mobilizing your higher education system within your own state, you could also encourage them to play a strong role. A number of our steering committee members are from our CU campuses. We actually have, I think, a member from at least 3, if not all 4 of our CU campuses. Higher education can serve on ESF 11D response teams. In the academic communities, professional networks are extremely important. So most people already belong to several. Higher education has the technology. They can administer and host listservs. And it strengthens the resilience of your own higher education system and enhances the reputation, which is something academia is concerned about. So, higher education, even more broadly, can help emergency managers and cultural and historic resources. You're going to find a great deal of technical expertise in higher education, okay? Whether it's about cultural and historic resources, whether it's architects who, professors architectural professors who deal in historic buildings, you're going to find a great deal of storage facilities that could be tapped into and used are most likely environmentally controlled. Freezers. So why do I have freezers on here? So one important thing to know about cultural and historic resources is that particularly those, I'm not talking about the built environment, I'm really talking about collections. And collections can consist of papers, textiles, artifacts of all kinds of materials. But particularly if you live in a humid environment or if you're dealing with flooding, mold can set in within 72 hours. And so how do you address that situation? You do it by stabilizing the environment. You want to get dehumidifiers in there, portable air conditioners, or you want to freeze the artifact. If you freeze the artifact, it's like a snapshot in time, and that buys you time to then deal with restoration of those artifacts. Higher education redundancy. Higher education has campuses and locations throughout their state. They have technology, personnel policies, they're concerned about their reputation. But not only that, higher education is, as I would argue with anyone, most likely one of your largest holders of cultural and historic resources in your state. So one more thing, and then I think I'm out of time and we'll turn it over to questions. I just want to highlight this picture that is currently on the screen. The Little Church in the Pines is another event that I'm extremely proud of. The Little Church in the Pines is actually on the National Register of Historic Places. It's in Salina, Colorado. This is the structure after the floods came through. As you can see, the entire, I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide so you can see the entire ground underneath the structure was literally washed away. I have another picture that isn't on here, but everything from where they're taking this picture from, the vantage point, was a road that was just literally destroyed by the power of the flood. And the task force was able to identify this as a national historic structure. We were able to secure an emergency $10,000 grant from History Colorado to help stabilize it. We were able to find an engineer that deals with historic structures that volunteered his time to go up and to help them figure out how to stabilize the structure. And so that's the power of our network and the power of our task force. And I am ready to take questions.
All right, great. Thank you, Leslie. Is there any questions from the group? All right, go ahead, Jeff.
Hi, Leslie. With a lot of your work, it's Jeff Jumper. I was able to make it in here for a portion of this. I just want to ask, with some of your work, do you feel that you run into a lot of issues? I know you said that sometimes when the UFC wasn't or was activated and there were fires ongoing, you guys just didn't get a lot of information. Do you see a lot of people that just look at what you do in the form of preserving the cultural side of things as secondary or tertiary when you're trying to work through things? Or are you getting some garnering support?
So, that's a great question, because when we first started our task force, it was a group of about 6 people who were champions, right? You often need a champion. But we weren't getting much traction. And then the fires and floods happened, and the first couple of fires in 2012, like the Lower North Fork fire, I mean, we were just listening in on the operational phone calls, and we really weren't even sure what we should be doing. But eventually, we started just within our own group saying, hey, we need to be doing this and this and this and this. And we didn't wait for anyone to tell us anything, and we just started doing things, and then we started providing situational awareness. Then we started producing results, and when we proved ourselves, we really established a credibility with our state emergency management office, which persists to this day. And so, yes, I mean, oftentimes cultural and historic resources are viewed as secondary, maybe even lower than that, which is rightly so. I mean, during the floods, we had wastewater treatment plants going out left and right throughout our state. I mean, that is something that people were getting sick from because they didn't have water, right? And so, yes, that is a life safety issue that is absolutely the top priority. But I believe now that we do have more support, that while cultural and historic resources are not the top priority, they are a priority. And particularly if we're willing to take responsibility for our own community, they're willing to support our efforts.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jeff and Leslie. I will turn it over to Chris then. anybody hear Chris?
No, we weren't able to.
No.
All right, Chris, you want to try again? If you want to type your question in the... Okay, sorry about that. If you want to type your question in the chat box, I can read it out loud yeah, that works. All right, so it looks like Chris is asking who we should go to for local subject matter experts to find information for CHR resources in the local county or city.
All right, that is also a really great question, Chris. So I'm going to talk about at multiple levels. Okay, so you can actually go to your state government as well. So your state government may or may not have something like a state library. Like here in Colorado, we have the Colorado State Library. We also have the state archives, and then we have History Colorado. So one of the challenges for the CHR community is that we often do not have one state agency that really covers the entire span of cultural and historic resources. So you have to, so you might have to go multiple places, and then you might also have to try to encourage those people to work together. So at your local level, though, so I'm a librarian, and so I would totally encourage you to reach out to your local public library, okay? You can either walk in to a building and say, I'm interested in talking to someone, or even better, find out who their library director is and send them an email or call them. Also, you may have a local historical society. You may also, and I believe this is a national program, there are what's called certified local governments who in the historic preservation arena. So you might just even Google your county or your city or town name and say certified local government historic preservation, because that's and you probably have some sort of historic preservation governmental board. It could be called different things. It may be called like a historical commission or board. And so I would encourage you to maybe start with those entities. And you may also, again, just rely on local knowledge and ask around. I mean, ask your friends, families, and colleagues. Look for museums in your area. You might have a local museum. And just, if you can reach out to one or two of those folks and connect with them, then they can lead you and help you navigate that community.
All right, thank you. All right, Brian, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Leslie, and thanks for doing this today. Interesting you brought up the Royal Gorge fire. I was actually out there visiting my sons about a week after that. Both of them live in Denver. And the amount of devastation from that, amazing, no loss of life, but the destruction of the visitor center and everything else. One of the things I found interesting in that fire, and I'm curious whether you had any connection to it, I watched the fire service and the use of drones to actually monitor and track the fire. It's one of the first times I think that it was effectively done by the fire service. But the bigger question, not so much a question, but a comment, this is a passion of mine. I'm involved in a number of Civil War organizations that work with battlefields, cemeteries, and other monuments, not just for preservation, but also for restoration. And the question I have is, what, if anything, have you been involved with in preparedness? the anticipation of a type of disaster, and how do you prevent excessive damage being done by taking steps in advance. It's a monuments men approach, but also it's preventative. So I ask you that. Thank you.
And that's a great question. And so out of necessity, we really have focused on the response arena. We actually are now beginning to talk about that exact scenario. There are a number of things that we would like to do. First of all, we would like local hazard mitigation plans to include cultural and historic resources, right? So we also would like to reach out to the CHR community. And we're fortunate that we have an organization called WebPath here that does regular workshops on how to create a disaster plan for the cultural and historic resources community. But even more importantly, particularly for things that you can't evacuate, like historic structures or monuments that you're going to have to protect and save, it's trying to reach out to those organizations and say things like, for us here, fire is a big thing, right? So, what's your landscaping like? Do you have built-in natural fire breaks? And again, doing that mitigation aspect, but we're not quite there yet. And about the word of gorge fire, so interestingly, I had not heard the drones were in use, but that doesn't surprise me. And Colorado has taken a number of steps in recent years because the Hyde Park fire up in the Colin area was really unfortunate because the fire department got a phone call the day before that afternoon and had gone out and tried to locate the fire and couldn't. And so by 10 o'clock the next morning, it was so bad that they were calling in an incident management team from outside the state. And so now Colorado does have, we actually purchased some planes, and their specific function is to be able to to fly over the state and use infrared technology and other technologies to locate fires. So it's really great that we have that kind of technology now.
All right, great. Are there any further questions? All right, Chris, if you want to type your question in the chat box. All right, it looks like Chris is interested in your evacuation planning for museums. Is your first priority evacuation, get the artifacts in the truck and go, or do you need first to have evacuation location locked down?
So, you know what, it depends on the situation, right? Worst case scenario is get in the truck and go and hope that you have some sort of lock or security on that vehicle, right? And so for the Western Museum of Mining and Industry, we were pulling everything together simultaneously. And so our first priority was to get trucks. And quite frankly, when you're dealing with cultural and historic resources, you're ideally packing things using archival quality materials, including boxes, paper, packing materials to cushion things. There are such things as archival quality, that literally they were going down to Home Depot and buying cardboard boxes and throwing things in and using blankets and just doing the best that they could do, because sometimes that's just what you have to do. And so it's always get it in the truck and get it out of the danger zone. And then if necessary, you can always lock down, find a lockdown location later on.
All right, thank you. Well, if there's no further questions, I'd like to thank Leslie for attending today. I think we all learned a lot. I just want to remind everyone, let's see. Okay, our next virtual series seminar is the October 23rd Friday seminar with Elise. So that will be another good one. And if you're available, we would love to have you again. This will be available on YouTube after the weekend, so please look for it there. And again, Leslie, thank you so much for joining us today. All right, thanks again for coming, everyone, and have a great weekend.